Radio Westeros, Episode 101, The Blackfyre Rebellions, Part 1.
Spoilers all books!
Hello there, I'm Yolkboy, and welcome to another episode of Radio Westeros. And as always, I'm joined by Lady Gwyn.
Yeah, hello there, and welcome. After the briefest of mentions in A Storm of Swords, George R. R. Martin fully introduced Daemon Blackfyre's rebellion to readers in his novella The Sworn Sword in 2003. Since then, he's backfilled a tremendous amount of history related not only to Daemon and his rebellion, but to the generations-long struggle between his descendants and their cousins of House Targaryen that followed.
And thanks to all that world building, we're happy to bring you this episode, the first in a series, all about the Blackfyre Rebellions. We'll begin with the historical background of the Blackfyre era, specifically the reign of Aegon IV, known as the Unworthy. How did Aegon's unworthiness lead directly to a civil war between his legitimate son and his illegitimate children? And did Aegon intentionally blow up his family's legacy by legitimizing all of his formerly bastard children on his deathbed?
Then we'll look at the reign of Daeron II, Aegon's son, who quickly became known as Daeron the Good. But in spite of many good qualities, what, or perhaps more pertinently, who, led his much younger half-brother Daemon to rise in rebellion against him?
Next up, we'll cover the rebellion itself, with a complete rundown of the main players and who fought for which side and why, leading up to a complete analysis of the famous decisive battle of the rebellion, the Battle of the Redgrass Field.
And finally, we'll review the aftermath and set up the next installment of this series, which we expect to run 2 more episodes. But before we move on, we'd like to thank all of our patrons over the years who've enabled us to keep Radio Westeros strong, including our Flaming Lightbringer patron, TJ Harrington, our Dragonsteel patrons, Maltude and Peter, and our Pale as Milk Glass patrons, Aka in the Company of the Cats, Crispy, the Song of Ice, Kelly, Sister Winter, MT Walls, first of his name, Schwartz the Black, John Wergarian, and Half-Maester Zach, as well as B-Word and Mr. J, the Bear and the Maiden Fair, and Sir Tim of House Jib Jab Hot Dog Shop. House motto, we forge the chains we wear in life.
And also a shout out to Kevin, one of our long-time Iron Level patrons that we want to thank for sticking with us for all these years. And if you are interested in becoming a patron and gaining access to perks like early release and exclusive content, check out our campaign at patreon.com/Radio Westeros. Come join us and keep our ship sailing. And now, let's get going with the Blackfyre Rebellion, Part 1.
Knights and lords of the Dornish marches came to mistrust Daeron and began to look more and more to the old days when Dornishmen were the enemy to fight, not rivals for the king's attention or largesse. And then they would look at Daemon Blackfyre, grown tall and powerful, half a god among mortal men, and with the conqueror's sword in his possession, and wonder.
When Prince Daeron Targaryen married Princess Maria Martell, he was fulfilling the terms of the peace treaty his cousin, King Baelor the Blessed, had forged with her father years earlier in the wake of his brother Daeron I's failed attempt to conquer Dorne. While the marriage, by all accounts, would go on to be a happy one, there were those in Westeros who could never accept peace with their ancient enemies to the south, never mind Dornishmen living in King's Landing.
And so, when Daeron ascended the throne as King Daeron II following his father's death 14 years later, and proceeded to make yet another marriage alliance with House Martell by promising his sister Daenerys to his wife's brother Prince Meryn, the stage would be set for dissent and unrest amongst the nobility of Westeros, in particular those from the Stormlands and the Reach.
but it was Daeron's own father who, in his final act, had poured the equivalent of gasoline onto the simmering flames of Westerosi resentment. And so, let's review the reign of Aegon IV, known to history as the Unworthy. Late in that reign, Aegon IV had, seemingly intentionally, wondered openly if his only legitimate son had been sired by another man. In doing so, he avoided the nuclear option of disinheriting Daeron by consistently favouring his eldest bastard son over his legitimate heir and, on his deathbed, declaring that all of his many bastards were to be legitimised.
But before we examine the question of why Aegon might have wanted to disinherit his only surviving legitimate son, we should quickly look at how Aegon, son of Aegon III's younger brother Viserys, became king in the first place, as well as the pertinent details of his reign.
Aegon III's second son, Baelor, became king after his older brother Daeron I died during his failed conquest of Dorne. Baelor was an extremely pious man who swiftly became known as Baelor the Blessed. He dressed in the simple robes of a septon and believed his most potent weapon was prayer. His barefoot pilgrimage into Dorne to make peace and ultimately save his cousin Aemon the Dragon Knight from imprisonment at will is the stuff of legend. But Baelor's extreme piety also led him to choose an ascetic lifestyle, which included a rejection of carnal desire.
A crowned king choosing to live a simple life and eschewing vanity, indulgence, and excess is unusual, perhaps even refreshing. A king who refuses to consummate his marriage is quite another matter, and some might argue a betrayal of his duty to provide an heir to the throne. But that is exactly what Baelor did when he refused to share a marriage bed with his sister wife, Dana.
Dana had been married to her brother Baelor when she was 15 and he 16, before the death of their brother Daeron. Shortly after Baelor's ascension, he set aside his wife, claiming that he had never consummated their union. Dana didn't deny it, but she did strenuously object to what happened next. Along with her two sisters, Rhaena and Elena, in an effort to supposedly keep their worldly beauty from tempting their holy brother to sin, Dana was confined to a set of apartments in the Red Keep that soon became known as the Maiden Vault, where they would spend the entire decade of Baelor's reign.
In 170 AC, 9 years into her imprisonment, Dana became pregnant and gave birth to a son she named Daemon, after her grandfather, the wonder and terror of his age. When questioned, she refused to name the boy's father. Her erstwhile husband was so shocked at his sister's defiance that he began a 40-day fast of atonement. On the 41st day, in early 171, Baelor the Blessed collapsed in the Great Sept and died.
There were those in Westeros who felt the crown should by rights pass to his sister Dana, the next in age of the 5 children of Aegon III and Daenerys Velaryon. But the dance of the dragons, ostensibly fought over the claim of a woman to the Iron Throne, Dana's own grandmother in fact, was just 2 generations past and dominated most people's thoughts. As well, Dana had been secluded in the Maiden Vault for a decade and lacked political allies. Plus, her behaviour in the years of her confinement, having earned her the moniker the Defiant, was not viewed favourably by men in power.
And so the throne passed to Dana's uncle Viserys, the youngest son of Rhaenyra and Daemon Targaryen, who had served as hand to the previous 3 kings. In relatively short order, Viserys himself passed away and was succeeded by his son, Aegon, the father of Prince Daeron, who had been married to Princess Myria Martell a year or so before and now had a son of his own, Prince Baelor.
Aegon IV earned his title the Unworthy through a lifetime of being utterly unable to curb his appetites. Lust for both flesh and power, gluttony and corruption dominated his rule. Married by his father to his younger sister Nerys at the age of 18, he sired two legitimate children, the aforementioned Daeron and Daenerys. But Aegon was not content with his wife, who was gentle and pious, and had numerous flagrant affairs over the years.
The noble mistresses of Aegon IV are only the most visible of the women Aegon consorted with, and it was their children, the so-called Great Bastards, who formed the most well-known block of offspring who were legitimized after their father's death. The eldest of those Great Bastards was a boy called Daemon, who was formally recognized by his father at the age of 12 when he was knighted and received the ancestral Targaryen sword Blackfyre from his father's hands.
And of course, Daemon was the boy who had been born in 170 AC to the king's cousin, Princess Daena Targaryen. Following Aegon's death in 184 AC, Daemon, who had once been called Waters, the typical name of bastards from the Crownlands, would choose the surname Blackfyre to denote his parentage and his legitimacy. Now formally in possession of both his father's favour and the Targaryen ancestral sword, and by the terms of their father's will ostensibly the equal in legitimacy to the new king, Daemon Blackfyre would soon, and perhaps unwittingly at first, become the central figure of a party at court that was composed largely of dissenters, men who had enjoyed the benefits of state-sponsored corruption and objected to Dornish presence in the capital and the royal family.
After his wife, Queen Nerys, died in childbirth in 179 AC, Aegon had leaned into persistent rumors, likely started by none other than himself, that she had been unfaithful and that her son Daeron was not in fact his son, but the son of their brother, the famed Kingsguard Aemon the Dragon Knight. This position probably had far less to do with Nerys and Aemon than it did with the fact that by this time, Prince Daeron himself had become a leading opponent of his father's, surrounded by a party of men who longed to see an end to the excesses and blatant corruption of Aegon's reign.
But of course, Aegon had not existed in a vacuum and was himself surrounded by men who still hated Dorne or had benefited from his vices in some way. These men comprised the party that was opposed by Daeron. Additionally, the 14-year-old Daemon was supposedly in love with his half-sister Daenerys, the much younger sister of the new king, who was soon promised to the Prince of Dorne. Nor did it help that Daemon was a quintessential warrior, while his half-brother Daeron was round-shouldered and bookish. And Daemon's possession of the ancestral sword Blackfyre was seen by many as a tacit statement by his father that Daemon was his preferred heir.
That's right. In The Sworn Sword, Sir Eustace Osprey explains to Sir Duncan the Tall and his squire Egg, unbeknownst to him the grandson of King Daeron the Good, why he sided with Daemon over Daeron. Here's the relevant portion of the passage. Daeron was spindly and round of shoulder, with a little belly that wobbled when he walked. Daemon stood straight and proud, and his stomach was flat and hard as an oaken shield, and he could fight. With axe or lance or flail, he was as good as any knight I ever saw, but with the sword, he was the warrior himself. When Prince Daemon had Blackfyre in his hand, there was not a man to equal him, not Ulrich Dane with Dawn, no, nor even the Dragon Knight with Dark Sister. Daemon was the better man. The old king saw it too. He gave the sword to Daemon, Blackfyre, the sword of Aegon the Conqueror, the blade that every Targaryen king had wielded since the conquest. He put that sword in Daemon's hand the day he knighted him, a boy of 12.
So, in short, the background of the first Blackfyre Rebellion is that Aegon IV proved his unworthiness by openly favouring his bastard son over the older legitimate son who opposed the corruption of his life, and by legitimising that favoured son on his deathbed. Daemon's possession of the sword Blackfyre and his martial abilities made him a natural candidate for a party opposed to Daeron's anti-corruption policies and his Dornish allies. Daeron himself, a good man, suffered by lacking the appearance and abilities of a warrior king, and of course from his father's nasty implication that he himself was a bastard.
As always, the truth is much more complicated than the tales that men tell. Furthermore, 12 years would pass before Daemon Blackfyre rose up in open rebellion. Up next, we'll review the events of those years as well as introduce some of the key figures in what would prove to be the Second Targaryen Civil War in less than a century.
Prince Daeron departed Dragonstone within the fortnight after learning of his father's demise and was swiftly crowned by the High Septon in the Red Keep. He chose to be crowned with his father's crown, a decision likely intended to quell any remaining doubts about his legitimacy. Daeron then acted swiftly to put right many of the things that Aegon had put wrong, beginning by removing all the members of the King's Small Council and replacing them with men of his own choosing, most of whom proved wise and capable counselors.
As king, Daeron's immediate goal was harm reduction. He replaced all of his father's counselors with men of his own and spent more than a year early in his reign reforming the city watch. Whereas his father had used the watch as a vehicle for rewarding his favorites, who would in turn ensure that all the women of King's Landing, both sex workers and everyday residents, were available for the king, Daeron wished for the watch to be composed of honorable men who had the city's protection and order as their main goal.
It's unknown who his Hand of the King was in those early years, but in 196 that role was filled by Lord Ambrose Butterwell, who had served as Master of Coin for Aegon IV and was the grandson of a Lord Butterwell who, as Aegon's hand, had been gifted a precious dragon egg in exchange for access to his 3 maiden daughters. Rumours said that all 3 became pregnant on the same night, though history is silent as to the truth of that rumour. The fact that none are mentioned during the years following Aegon's deathbed declaration of legitimacy for his bastards implies that either the story is exaggerated or they did not survive, or that their family had hidden their parentage by swiftly marrying the daughters off.
Daeron also made sure to treat his now legitimized half-siblings very carefully. Those of noble parentage known as the Great Bastards were kept very close and confirmed in the incomes that their father had bestowed upon them. Daeron also very carefully fulfilled the terms of a marriage agreement the old king had arranged for Daemon Blackfyre. Aegon had promised Daemon to the daughter of the Archon of Tyrosh, a girl known as Rohan. Daeron paid the dowry that had been agreed upon, and as a wedding gift granted the newlyweds attractive land along the Blackwater, along with the right to raise a castle there.
While some argued that Daeron was an altruistic leader who treated his legitimized half-siblings well out of kindness, others asserted that he did so in an attempt to maintain control and emphasize his own legitimacy. None seem to acknowledge the complicated fact that both could be true, and so the issue of Aegon's legitimized bastards continued to simmer at the margins of Daeron's reign for over a decade.
But Daeron's reign was not wholly consumed with correcting issues that arose from his father's misrule. His own marriage to Princess Myria of Dorne, now his queen, had been, as we said earlier, largely happy. They had 4 sons, the eldest of whom was of an age with Daemon Blackfyre. And while their happy union was a testament to the peace forged by Baelor the Blessed and Queen Myria's father, the question of Dorne's place in the realm remained incomplete.
And so, in 187 AC, 3 years into his reign, Daeron saw his own sister, Princess Daenerys, married to his wife's brother, the ruling Prince of Dorne, Maron Martell. Following their marriage, the Prince of Dorne swore an oath of fealty to the Iron Throne, and king and prince together laid a wreath at the feet of the statue of Baelor outside the Great Sept, declaring, "Baelor, your work is done." In truth, it was the work of Daeron's ancestor Aegon the Conqueror which was now complete, as his centuries-old dream of a unified Westeros at last became a reality.
Following his sister's marriage to Maron Martell, Daeron raised a new Targaryen castle in the Dornish Marches. Called Summerhall, it was significant as a symbol of the new peace between Dorne and their neighbors, in that it was a palace rather than a walled fortress, as Marcher castles had always been in the past. But many in Westeros, as we've said, were unwilling to let go of centuries of cross-border hatred. As well, the concessions that had been granted to House Martell, namely the rights to retain their royal titles, to maintain their own system of law, and to levy taxes with little oversight by the crown, seemed unfair to those houses who had bent the knee to Daeron's ancestor and been denied such privileges.
As was perhaps natural, Daeron also favoured a number of his wife's kinsmen and Dornish connections, and so his reign saw an increase in Dornish names at court and in positions of influence. In fact, within a few years of his ascension, Daeron saw his youngest son married to a Dornish noblewoman from the ancient House Dane, while he had carefully married his heir to Jenna Dondarrion from the prominent Marcher house. This third Dornish marriage in the royal family surely stood out as more evidence of Daeron's preferential treatment of Dorne. All told, Daeron's decisions around Dorne are almost certainly at the heart of the dissatisfaction in the realm which would ultimately lead to Daemon Blackfyre's rebellion.
And speaking of marriages, as we've said, another issue said to be at the center of Daemon's rebellion was his supposed love of his half-sister Daenerys, her marriage to Maron Martell, and his own marriage to Rohanne of Tyrosh. But in truth, the Tyroshi marriage had been planned by Aegon IV a year before his death, and once concluded, without any overt objections on Daemon's part, would prove to be quite fruitful, with 7 sons and at least 2 daughters being born to the couple in quick succession, including the twins Aegon and Aemon, born in 184 AC, several years before Daenerys was wed to the Prince of Dorne.
To overcome this apparent inconsistency on Daemon's part, there were those who later claimed that the old king had promised his natural son that he would be allowed to revive the practice of polygamy and take 2 wives. Whether this had been part of Aegon IV's plan to convince his son to make the Tyroshi marriage, in which he saw much profit to be made, is a matter of debate. It was certainly not a solution that Daeron entertained or would have entertained, and in truth, the issue of whether the subject was ever raised prior to or after Daemon's marriage to Rohanne of Tyrosh is entirely in the realm of conjecture.
Many generations later, Daenerys' descendant Doran Martell would say of her, "The whole realm knew that the girl loved Daeron's bastard brother Daemon Blackfyre and was loved by him in turn, but the king was wise enough to see that the good of thousands must come before the desires of 2, even if those 2 were dear to him." In spite of this assertion, there's hardly a scrap of evidence as to what Princess Daenerys herself felt.
Yeah, although there are many declarations from third parties regarding her feelings for a half-brother, as Maester Yandel points out in the World Book, in the years following her marriage and Daemon's rebellion, quote, Daenerys was never aught but a loyal wife to Prince Meron, and if she mourned Daemon Blackfyre's death, she left no record of it. So, in fact, what we do know about Daenerys seems to indicate she was of a similar temperament to her eldest brother, Daeron.
And nowhere is that more evident than in the story of the Water Gardens. The Water Gardens is a pleasure palace of House Martell built 3 leagues west of the Martell seat at Sunspear as a refuge from the dust and heat of the city by none other than Maron Martell for his wife Daenerys. It possesses a unique feature that says much about the Targaryen princess's mindset.
The water gardens are specifically a feature of the palace, a network of orange tree-filled gardens surrounding cooling pools overlooked by pink marble terraces. And in those pools, children play. History tells us that Prince Maron meant the pools to cool his own children and their nobly born companions, but that his wife, one particularly hot and miserable season, took pity on the children of the serving folk of the castle and opened the pools to all children.
And once she saw the diverse group of children splashing and laughing in the pools, it's said that, quote, a realization came to her. She could not tell the highborn from the low. Naked, they were only children, all innocent, all vulnerable, all deserving of long life, love, protection. And that principle has been passed down to all the ruling members of House Martell unto the present day, as we hear from Prince Daeron Martell himself in A Dance with Dragons.
Later in the same chapter, Prince Daeron references that history once again, telling his daughter and nieces that the lesson the Water Gardens teaches is, it is an easy thing for a prince to call the spears, but in the end the children pay the price. For their sake, the wise prince will wage no war without good cause, nor any war he cannot hope to win. This philosophy seems to underpin House Martell's general reluctance to engage in open warfare and makes the Water Gardens a living symbol of the peace brought about by Daenerys' marriage to Maro Martell. We have to wonder if perhaps Daenerys herself first thought about children and the price of war as her half-brother waged his war of rebellion against her full brother, supposedly in her name.
All of which is to say that, whether there was once a youthful passion between the two or not, there is no indication that Daemon Blackfyre could have possibly achieved anything with regards to his half-sister by rebelling against his brother. While wars have often been attributed to such things as wronged lovers or kidnapped sweethearts, it's rarely so simple. Even the Trojan War, for millennia, stated to have been fought over the kidnap of the woman who would become known as Helen of Troy, is now reckoned by historians to have actually been fought due to trade rivalries and the control of a key maritime passage which the city of Troy commanded. And so, rather than the romantic fable offered by his supporters, we should probably look elsewhere for the actual reasons behind Daemon's rebellion. And the best place to look in any civil war of this nature is at those who had something to gain from it.
And perhaps we can identify a cadre of those who had something to gain from Daemon's rebellion by identifying those who lost something with Daeron's succession. We've mentioned the Dornish issue already and the significance of a Targaryen king married to a Dornish princess, with children who had the dark hair and eyes of House Martell rather than the silver hair and purple eyes of their Targaryen ancestors. It's an issue that cannot be overstated.
And besides an apparent systemic racial bias against Dornish people, there would have been the issue of royal favors, and, as we mentioned earlier, the apparent favoritism inherent in the terms of Dorne's entry into the realm. In a feudal economy, having the power to levy taxes and make laws without intervention from the monarch, in whom those powers were supposed to reside, would have been a major concession in the eyes of those who hadn't been granted such favorable terms. And such concessions might have had the end result of making the monarch who approved them seem weak.
And then there was the issue of the Great Bastards. Given everything we've ever heard about the very strong cultural bias against bastards among Westeros' ruling class, surely there were those who found Daeron's gentle treatment of his legitimized half-siblings distasteful. While it seems unlikely that those individuals would be likely to support the bastard Daemon Blackfyre en masse, we do see several unironic examples of this inherent prejudice against bastards in the Mystery Knight amongst those who supported the Blackfyre cause. Such a viewpoint says a lot about why certain nobles might have supported Daemon and definitely could have contributed to lukewarm enthusiasm for Daeron's policies, not to mention furthering a general impression that the king was weak, lacking in the qualities of a strong king.
And when we look at who might have stood to gain from Daeron's overthrow by his half-brother, the list at first glance seems to be composed of men of little consequence. But that might be exactly the point. All of the known lords paramount of the day either overtly supported Daeron or can be presumed to have done so by their lack of involvement in the rebellion, perhaps due to their general reluctance to support a bastard against a nobly born king. We can probably best describe this group as those who supported the status quo.
But in each region, apart from the North and Iron Islands, who seem to have not participated at all, there are men who supported Daemon who might have expected to gain something from an overthrow of the status quo. Let's take the example of Sir Eustace Osgrey. In The Sworn Sword, Sir Duncan the Tall goes into service for a very minor landed knight in the Reach. Sir Eustace resides in a small tower house known as Standfast, and over the course of the novella, it becomes obvious he supported the Black Dragon, Daemon Blackfyre, during the recent rebellion.
And we've already cited Sir Eustace's words to Dunk regarding the difference, as he saw it, between Daemon and his half-brother Daeron Targaryen, and his ostensible reason for supporting Daemon's cause. But there's additional background that we learn in the novella from other sources that indicate Sir Eustace actually had a much different reason for joining the rebellion that's likely a strong indicator of what motivated many of Daemon's other supporters when you peek behind the curtain of romantic stories and the imagery of a noble hero and warrior king that's so often painted of Daemon.
House Osgrey is an old house of First Men origins, and their service to House Gardner, the original Kings of the Reach, dates back centuries. Under House Gardner, the Osgreys were known as the Marshals of the North March, meaning they were responsible for guarding the borderlands between the northern part of the Kingdom of the Reach and the Westerlands. As powerful landholders, they intermarried with some of the most storied houses in the Reach, and were known to hold 4 great castles, the foremost of which was Coldmoat.
Following the Targaryen conquest of Westeros, House Osgrey began to diminish. Their longtime overlords and patrons, House Gardner, died on the Field of Fire, and the new overlords of the Reach, House Tyrell, had no history with and no particular loyalty to the Osgreys. According to Sir Eustace, "It was there at the Field of Fire our woes began, 200 years ago. The last of the Green Kings perished on that field, and the finest flowers of the Reach around him. My father said that the dragon fire burned so hot that their swords melted in their hands. Afterwards, the blades were gathered up and went to make the Iron Throne. Highgarden passed from kings to stewards, and the Osgreys dwindled and diminished until the marshals of the North March were no more than landed knights bound in fealty to the Rowans."
Then, during the reign of King Maegor the Cruel, one of Sir Eustace's ancestors spoke out against the king's suppression of the faith militant. For this affront, Lord Ormond Osgrey was stripped of his seat at Coldmoat, and this is likely when they were reduced in status from lords to landed knights.
Certainly by Sir Eustace's time there was no lordship and only the single tower house with a very small area of land left to support House Osgrey. At some point, neighboring Coldmoat had been awarded to House Webber, and during the latter part of the 2nd century AC, Lord Wyman Webber was its master. Lord Wyman's sons had all died in infancy, and his only heir was a daughter, the Lady Rohan. While there appear to have been genuine feelings between Rohan Webber and Sir Eustace's son Adam, when Sir Eustace suggested to his neighbor that their children be joined in marriage, no doubt seeing an opportunity for his house to regain some of what it had lost in the prior century, Lord Wyman refused the suggestion out of hand.
In the Sworn Sword, we learn that though Lord Wyman's refusal was courteous, Sir Eustace, quote, heard him laughing with Sir Lucas Inchfield, the castle's castellan, as he departed. The bad feelings engendered by Lord Wyman's refusal had a direct impact on Sir Eustace's eventual decision to join the Blackfyre cause. Sir Eustace, according to Lady Rohan Webber, quote, chose the black dragon over the red in the hope that a Blackfyre king might restore the lands and castles that the Osgreys had lost under the Targaryens.
So, there you have it. In spite of his insistence upon romantic fables, Sir Eustace Osgrey was primarily motivated by what Daemon Blackfyre might do for him should he win his rebellion. After nearly 2 centuries of diminishment under Targaryen rule, House Osgrey stood at a crossroads and, as we'll see, chose the wrong turning.
And this story was repeated in one form or another across the realm. Also in the Reach, Lord Gorman Peake had good reason to despise the ruling Targaryens. Several of his ancestors had perished at the Field of Fire, fighting with the Gardeners, and, similar to House Osgrey, in spite of centuries of influence with House Gardener, they had no particular connection with the new ruling house of the Reach, House Tyrell. More recently, Lord Unwin Peake had supported the Greens in the Dance of the Dragons, perhaps hoping their connection with the Reach via House Hightower would lead to greater influence for House Peake. And certainly, for a time, that looked like it might come to pass.
You may recall from our coverage of that period that in the wake of Aegon II's death, Unwin Peake was named part of the Council of Regents for Aegon III following the death of Lord Corlys Velaryon. After the death of the Hand, Sir Tywin Lannister, Lord Unwin named himself Hand and began to consolidate his influence. He appointed 2 of his relatives to the Kingsguard and 2 of his men as Master-at-Arms at the Red Keep and Commander of the City Watch. He replaced Septon Eustace, confessor to Targaryen kings since the days of Viserys II and one of the principal chroniclers of the dance, with another relation, and continued to place relatives and liegemen in every area of influence he possibly could.
Within a matter of months, Peake had aggregated enormous power in King's Landing, including naming his uncle commander of the royal fleet and placing his aunt, Lady Clarice Osgrey, in charge of a young Queen Jaehaera's household. Things began to unravel quickly when Queen Jaehaera died of apparent suicide, and whispers that Lord Peake had the child murdered began to circulate. To make a long and complex story short, Lord Peake's undoing would turn out to be his designs on making his own daughter the new queen.
Although Lord Peake went so far as to summon his daughter to court, there was disagreement on the Council of Regents about the match, and so Peake declared a ball, known as the Maiden's Day Ball, at which the king would select his new wife from all the eligible ladies present. Against the backdrop of this grand event, it was evident that Peake expected his own choice to prevail. However, Lord Peake was despised by the new young king and his half-sisters, as well as by their cousin, Alan Velaryon. And so his wishes were foiled when the king's sisters, Rhaena and Baela Targaryen, arrived at the ball with their young cousin, Lady Daenerys Velaryon, in tow. It soon became clear that Aegon would entertain none of the maidens present other than Daenerys, including, and perhaps especially, Lady Muriel Peake.
Lord Unwin ultimately resigned his position in a huff, but all of his appointees remained. Within a year, a massive conspiracy that placed the lives of the entire royal family at risk was uncovered, and the perpetrators were revealed to be mostly drawn from those who had been placed in their positions by none other than Lord Unwin Peake. While it was never proved that he had been secretly directing this conspiracy from afar, the rumors persisted, and Peake's influence was severely diminished.
Fast forward to the Blackfyre era, House Peake was led by Lord Gorman Peake of Starpike. Just over a half century since the rapid rise and descent of his kinsman, can we doubt that Lord Gorman, whom we eventually see on page and learn is an extremely prideful and prickly man, may have been motivated by a desire to see the descendants of those Targaryens who had humiliated and diminished his ancestors brought low? As a knight of some reputation, it's very easy to see how this particular lord may have been convinced to support the cause of Daemon Blackfyre in hopes that he could reap some benefit and reward for his service.
In the Riverlands, the grievances were slightly more recent. Both House Lothston and Bracken had supplied King Aegon IV with 2 mistresses and 1 hand of the king. Neither made out well in the bargain. Lest his family spread unpleasant tales, the Hand Lord Lucas Lothston was banished back to Harrenhal when his daughter, who some whispered was actually Aegon's daughter due to the fact that her mother, Lady Felaena Stokeworth, had once been the king's mistress, caught a pox from the king. As bad as that is, House Bracken's grievance was even greater.
Aegon IV had famously abandoned his mistress, Lady Barba Bracken, mother of Aegor Rivers, later known as Bittersteel, in favor of Lady Melissa Blackwood, mother to 3 of Aegon's bastards, including Brynden, later known as Bloodraven. Besides the undeniable weight of the centuries-old rivalry between the 2 Riverlands houses, and, to add insult to injury, Lady Melissa was well-liked at court, whereas Lady Barba had been merely tolerated. And so Barba's father began grooming his youngest daughter, Bethany, to replace the Lady Melissa in turn.
For a time, it was a strategy that appeared successful. King Aegon did indeed take Bethany Bracken as his mistress, but as he was now approaching 50 and had become exceedingly corpulent, she grew to find his embraces distressing. When she sought relief in the arms of one of the King's Guards, Sir Terence Toyne, they were inevitably discovered, and Lady Bethany and her father were both summarily executed, but only after they were forced to watch the dismemberment of Sir Terence. The aftermath of this affair, wherein Sir Terence's brothers attempted to murder the king, only to be killed by and in turn kill Prince Aemon the Dragon Knight, created yet another grievance against the Targaryens, as history will show.
So, whether they had suffered at the hands of the Conqueror, his son Maegor, his descendants during the dance, or even more recently during the abusive and dysfunctional reign of Aegon the Unworthy, these types of stories were repeated across the Reach, Riverlands, and Westerlands in particular, and it's from families who had similar grievances to those we've mentioned that the vast majority of Daemon Blackfyre's supporters were drawn. In short, whatever Daemon's own reasons for rebelling were, the men who supported him cared less for his injured feelings over a marriage that seems to have never been a real possibility than they did for their own potential for revenge and or advancement.
But as we've already mentioned, there certainly were those whose hatred of Dorne and the Dornish, in most cases embedded in their families over centuries of wars, raids, and border skirmishes, was so strong that they would rather rebel against the crown than accept a king who not only had a Dornish wife, but had made peace with the hated enemy and brought Dornish knights and lords to court, where they were given positions of honor.
Amongst these would have been numerous Marcher lords in the Stormlands and the Reach, along with houses like the Oakhearts and Hightowers, who had a long history of fighting the Dornish. The Oakhearts had suffered notable losses during the Dornish Wars, with Lord Oakhart slain and his daughter Alice and her maids captured and sold into slavery by the Wills of Will on the very eve of her marriage to Sir John Caffarin of Fontaine in the Stormlands. Later, during Daeron I's conquest of Dorne, Sir Oliver of the Greenoak was a member of Daeron's Kingsguard who died along with his king when their party, riding under a banner of peace, was treacherously ambushed by Dornish assassins.
Both Hightower and Oakhart are known to have played both sides during the Blackfyre era, which implies that they were hedging their bets while also perhaps seeking a future where the peace with Dorne and Dornish members of the ruling house were a thing of the past. Unfortunately for George R. R. Martin, on a meta level, he had already written the major Marcher Lords of houses Caron, Dondarrion, Swan, and Tarly into the story of the tourney at Ashford Meadow, which notably was written before he had conceived of the Blackfyre story arc.
Yeah, the presence of all those lords at the tourney that was the centerpiece of the Hedge Knight, in contrast to the tourney of traitors that we see in the Mystery Knight, not to mention Prince Baelor Targaryen's marriage to Jenna Dondarrion, applies in hindsight that they were all loyalists. And so we imagine that when it came to sketching out the two sides of the rebellion, George left those more powerful houses on the side of Daeron, while inventing numerous smaller houses to take Daemon's side, houses of middling power and wealth that might be expected to have grievances similar to those of House Osgrey and Peake, in addition to hating Dorne. And so we also get houses Risley, Verwell, Caswell, Cockshaw, and Ball from the Reach, who all side with Daemon, along with a variety of similar small houses from the Riverlands, Westerlands, and Stormlands.
Yeah, and this is interesting because the way the canon has grown, most of these houses have now been written into the histories, the world of Ice and Fire and Fire and Blood, meaning they are present in stories from the days of the conquest, the dance, and beyond. But it's important to remember that they first appear on page in The Sworn Sword and the Mystery Knight, where George introduced us to the Blackfyres and their rebellion.
And finally, there's one last oddity to be found amongst the apparent supporters of Daemon Blackfyre. House Ironwood is the second most powerful house in Dorne, longtime rivals of House Martell, who had mostly lived in peace with their overlords since Nymeria's day. But the Ironwoods had also fought against Targaryens and suffered during their Dornish wars, and their bannermen of House Will are famously the house who captured the Dragon Knight and held him captive in a cage until he was rescued by his cousin, King Baelor.
For reasons that are not defined but can be guessed at, House Ironwood joined the Blackfyres in their cause fighting against the Targaryens, in spite of, or perhaps because of, the fact that the Targaryens were married to members of House Martell. While this is an interesting tidbit in the context of the Blackfyre arc, we can't help but ponder how it might be significant in the main story, in the context of the Ironwoods being in control of a Dornish army that waits in the Boneway, and the arrival of young Aegon Targaryen, who many suspect is a Blackfyre descendant, on the shores of Westeros in 300 AC.
As ever, we wait to see what the significance of this history that's been so carefully established might be. But as that speculation is well outside our scope here, we must return to Daeron's reign in the previous century. In spite of everything we've mentioned thus far, Daeron was a popular king who worked hard to right many of the wrongs of his father's reign. He became known as Daeron the Good by small folk and nobles alike early on, and he was fortunate in his sons, with his heir Prince Baelor, known as Breakspear for his prowess in the lists, proving to be as wise and just as his father, and his youngest son Maekar also showing promising signs of becoming a warrior of renown.
And so we'll end this section with the words of Maester Yandel, who tells us in the World Book, "Yet too many men looked upon Baelor's dark hair and eyes, and muttered that he was more Martell than Targaryen, even though he proved a man who could win respect with ease, and was as open-handed and just as his father. Knights and lords of the Dornish marches came to mistrust Daeron and Baelor as well, and began to look more and more to the old days, when Dornishmen were the enemy to fight, not rivals for the king's attention or largesse. And then they would look at Daemon Blackfyre, grown tall and powerful, half a god among mortal men, and with the conqueror's sword in his possession, and wonder."
Up next, we'll explore the breaking point, or exactly when and how all the various bases we've discussed here combined to lead Daemon Blackfyre into open rebellion against his brother. But first, it's time to thank our patrons from the Valyrian Steel level. Thanks so much to Aileen, Oxheart, Amber the Adamant, Arshia, Blithe Spirit, Archmaester Kobe of the Higher Mysteries, Cabot the Unfrozen, Dean, Dolorous Fred, Lord Sosa and his faithful canine companion Theoden, Jill, JM, Herbert Westeros, the Miskatonic Maester, Kevin, Lady Silverwing, Mark, the Sithorian, W, Sword of the Evening, and Lady Direliz of Castle Naki, the Alpha Patron, as well as our Dragonglass patrons, Ainge, Lynn, Leonardo Corleone, Lady Faith, Maiden of the Tree, and Fairy Glen.
The seeds of rebellion had been planted, but it took years for them to bear fruit. There was no final insult, no great wrong that led Daemon Blackfyre to turn against King Daeron. If it was truly all for the love of Daenerys, how is it that 8 years passed before the rebellion bloomed? That was a long time to harbour thwarted love, especially when Rohan had already given him 7 sons and daughters besides, and Daenerys had also borne Prince Mauron several heirs.
Of all the factors that contributed to Daemon's rebellion, one that we've so far only glanced at is that of the so-called Great Bastards, since one of them would prove to be instrumental in converting grievances into action, while another two would be key figures on Daeron's side. Let's begin here by digging into these important individuals.
Specifically, the Great Bastards numbered 6 individuals, with Daemon Blackfyre being the eldest. The others were, in order of birth, Aegor Rivers, son of Barbara Bracken, Maya, Gwenys, and Brynden Rivers, children of Melissa Blackwood, and Shiera Seastar, daughter of the Lyseni noblewoman known as Serene of Lys, the last of Aegon IV's mistresses, who died giving birth to her only child.
The girls, Maya and Gwenys, do not come into the story at all, but their brother Brynden is a key figure on the Loyalist side, as is their half-sister Shiera. But it's Aegor Rivers that we want to focus on first. His childhood and upbringing are extremely relevant to the course of events we're analyzing, and so we'll start with his birth in 172 AC.
Barbara Bracken was a daughter of the Lord of Stonehenge, who had been sent to the Maiden Vault as a young woman as a companion to King Baelor's sisters in the last years of his reign. In this, Lord Bracken was following numerous other nobles who had similarly sent their young daughters to be ladies-in-waiting to the Targaryen princesses in hopes of currying favour with the king.
When Baelor died in 171 AC, following the birth of Daemon Waters to his sister Dana, the princesses were released from their confinement, and they and their companions became part of court life. Officially, this is when Prince Aegon first met Lady Barba, a buxom and high-spirited young woman with whom he reportedly became entranced. It's worth pointing out that, considering Dana bore Aegon a child while still confined to the Maiden Vault, during Lady Barba's time there, it's entirely possible that the pair had met, or at least were aware of each other, prior to Baelor's death.
When his father died the following year and Aegon ascended the throne as King Aegon IV, he lost no time in openly securing Lady Barbara Bracken as his mistress. Though he was 20 years her senior and had been married to his sister Nerys for nearly 18 years, he named her father as his hand, and before the year was out, she had given birth to a son named Aegor. Aegor was born only 2 weeks before Queen Nerys almost died, giving birth to Princess Daenerys, and what happened next would lead to the downfall of Barbara Bracken as the king's mistress.
Lord Bracken, the Hand, was apparently so giddy at the favor that had been bestowed upon his daughter that he began to speak openly of marrying that daughter to the king once the queen had obligingly died. However, Nerys did not die, and the Hand's open talk of marriage between his now soiled daughter and the king became a scandal, which led to Aegon's brother and son, Aemon the Dragon Knight, and Prince Daeron, forcing him to give up his mistress, who was sent packing from King's Landing with her infant.
And so Aegor Rivers was raised at Stonehenge, while, to add insult to injury, back in King's Landing his father took up with a new mistress, the Lady Melissa Blackwood. The rivalry between Bracken and Blackwood is legendary in Westeros, rising from disputes dating back to the Age of Heroes. Each succeeding generation seemed to find new issues to fight about, and in Aegon's day it seems it was to be Barba versus Melissa.
The Lady Melissa was described as being prettier than Lady Barba, as well as being kind and modest, which were not qualities ascribed to her predecessor. She was also younger, though both were in truth only teenagers and much younger than the king, who was their lover. Melissa was also quite slender, whereas Barba was curvy. During his brief relationship with Barba Bracken, the king had jokingly renamed a pair of hills in her family's possession in the Riverlands from the mother's teats to Barba's teats. However, when he heard that his disgruntled former mistress had been making snide remarks about Lady Melissa being, quote, flat as a boy, the king renamed the hills once again to Missy's Teats, and transferred ownership of the land to House Blackwood, where it remains to this day.
The king's proclamation of ownership didn't stop the Brackens from calling the hills what they would and continuing to claim the land they had once owned for generations to come, but this was merely a continuation of the constant disputes over lands and boundaries that had plagued the two houses for centuries. It was the open humiliation of Lady Barba that led her father, apparently still Hand of the King, in spite of it being his boast that had caused his daughter's dismissal from court, to plot his revenge.
During the 5 years Melissa Blackwood spent as mistress to the king, she bore him 3 children, the aforementioned Maya, Gwenys, and Brynden. Melissa was such a kind soul that she was able to befriend not only Queen Nerys, but also her brother Prince Aemon and her son Prince Daeron, becoming much beloved at court. But, like her predecessor, her own downfall would also be laid at the feet of the Hand, Lord Bracken.
As we said earlier, after Barba's disgrace, Lord Bracken, with her assistance, began grooming his youngest daughter Bethany to attract the attention of the king and replace Lady Melissa in his bed. The plan worked when Aegon visited Stonehenge in 177 AC to visit his young son Aegor and was introduced to Lady Bethany. We've already mentioned what happened when she was brought back to King's Landing, but to recap, Lady Melissa was indeed dismissed, and Bethany Bracken, to her father's evident delight, became the king's 7th mistress.
However, Aegon's descent into physical ruin was well accelerated at this point, and he had become grotesquely fat as well as foul-tempered. Though he declared himself entranced with his new mistress, as he had been with her sister, she herself seemed ill-prepared to accept his embraces and found herself turning to one of his Kingsguard, the handsome knight Sir Terence Toyne, for comfort. And as we said earlier, when the two were found in bed together, Sir Terence was brutally executed by dismemberment, while Bethany and her father were forced to watch before they were also summarily executed, resulting in a potent grievance between House Bracken and House Targaryen.
For this reason, as well as due to the contrast in their mothers' natures, Aegor Rivers and Brynden Rivers would have extremely different upbringings. Young Aegor remained at Stonehenge with his mother, nursing their grievances, while at Raventree Hall, Melissa's children seem to have had a much happier childhood, and the lady herself was able to maintain some of her connections at court due to her kind and friendly nature, which would help her son in turn to maintain his own relationships with his Targaryen kin.
Aegor, it was said, never smiled. Maester Yandel asserts that he was choleric and quick to take offense, qualities that he attributes to Aegor's Bracken blood, before wondering if it was the ignominious fall of the Brackens in King Aegon's esteem, which had led to the boy's virtual exile from his father's presence. Obviously, being raised by a mother and likely other family members who were bitter about the hand that fate had dealt them and no doubt looked with jealousy at the continued favor received by Lady Melissa Blackwood and her children did not help young Aegor's outlook.
By the time he was in his early 20s, he had grown into a dark-haired, purple-eyed warrior about whom it would later be said was a hard man who had little use for anything beyond war. So angry and warlike did he become that the name Bittersteel was used and stuck with him for the rest of his life. Bittersteel took his own arms, which, as a king's acknowledged bastard, could have been similar to those of his half-brother Daemon, the Targaryen arms with colours reversed. But Aegor Rivers chose to lean into his Bracken heritage and took the rampant red stallion and golden field of their arms, reversed in direction and with the addition of black dragon wings, perhaps a nod to his affinity with Daemon Blackfyre and Fiery Breath. Very cool arms for a very hard and angry man.
One might assume that Aegor was raised to hate his younger half-brother Brynden Rivers due to the ancient rivalry between their houses and the more recent rivalry between their mothers. And to a certain extent, that was true. There was certainly no love lost between the two brothers. But this dislike would turn into bitter hatred when the youngest of their half-siblings, the lovely Shera Seastar, daughter of Sereny of Lys, chose Brynden Rivers, now known as Bloodraven for the wine-stained birthmark on his face that some saw as being in the shape of a raven, over Bittersteel.
They say hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, but Bittersteel would certainly prove the inversion of that aphorism. At the same time, the angry young man apparently had great admiration for his slightly older half-brother. And so, when certain warriors and warlike lords, dismayed at the peace with Dorne and the Dornish presence in the capital, began to seek out Daemon Blackfyre to ply him with compliments and complaints about his elder brother the king, they would find Bittersteel at his side, always ready to fan the flames of their grievances and accelerate the flow of poison into his brother's ears.
According to Yandel, it was Bittersteel who first began to press Daemon into declaring himself the rightful king, and during this time, he was also able to get Daemon to agree to Rivers' betrothal to his eldest daughter, Calla, who was still a young girl, likely no more than 10 years old at the time. As Yandel puts it in the World Book, bitter his steel may have been, but worse was his tongue. He spilled poison in Daemon's ear, and with him came the clamoring of other knights and lords with their grievances. Finally, by 196 AC, it says, years of such talk bore their fruit, and Daemon Blackfyre made his decision.
Maester Yandel hastens to add, yet it was a decision he made rashly, for word soon reached King Daeron that Blackfyre meant to declare himself king within the turn of the moon. Though the specifics aren't known, it's heavily implied that Bloodraven was involved in the intelligence gathering that led to the order for Daemon Blackfyre's arrest. However, when the King's Guard went forth to take the king's brother into custody for treason, they found that he had in turn been forewarned and had escaped with the help of the Red Keep's Master at Arms, Sir Quentin Ball, known as Fireball.
And Fireball, it would turn out, had his own grievance against King Daeron. He had served in his position as Master-at-Arms during the reign of King Aegon, who had apparently promised the famously hot-tempered knight a position in his Kingsguard. Accordingly, Ball had forced his wife to join the Silent Sisters to make way for the White Cloak that had been promised. But King Aegon had died before the promise could be fulfilled, and when a place opened in the Kingsguard of his son King Daeron, that cloak was instead awarded to Sir Willem Wilde.
So, here we have yet another grievance-filled, hot-tempered knight looking to leverage Daemon's position for his own gain. Following his escape, Daemon's allies used the attempted arrest as a rallying cry for their rebellion, falsely claiming that the arrest was being made without cause but out of baseless fear. Others repeated the false rumours of Daeron's birth, calling him false-born and naming their candidate as the eldest true-born son of Aegon IV, completely ignoring the fact that the boy had lived the first 14 years of his life as the very privileged bastard of a Targaryen princess and had only had the stain of his own birth wiped clear by his father's deathbed proclamation.
In fact, logically speaking, and under the conditions of the Faith of the Seven, Queen Nerys's innocence of those slanderous charges had been settled long ago when the Dragon Knight had challenged her accuser, one Sir Morgil Hastwyck, whom some suspected had been put up to openly making his accusation by the king himself, to a trial by combat, at which the Dragon Knight was the victor. According to the rules of such trials, Sir Morgil's death had proved the Queen's innocence in the matter, as well as the favor of the gods, and she could never again be questioned on the same issue by the faithful.
However, in matters of propaganda, as most of us know very well, logic need not apply. All that mattered in this case was the strength of the grievances of the men with whom Daemon Blackfyre had chosen to surround himself. And those grievances, as we've discussed here so far, went very deep indeed. And so, in the year 196 AC, the second Targaryen civil war of the century would begin, this time between half-brothers rather than half-brother and sister, and thankfully for the people of Westeros, also without dragons. Up next, we'll dive into everything we know about the war, leading up to its climactic conclusion at a place that would come to be known as the Redgrass Field.
In this manner did the first Blackfyre Rebellion begin in the year 196 AC, reversing the colors of the traditional Targaryen arms to show a black dragon on a red field. The rebels declared for Princess Dana's bastard son, Daemon Blackfyre, first of his name, proclaiming him the eldest true son of Aegon IV, and his half-brother Daeron, the bastard. Subsequently, many battles were fought between the Black and Red Dragons in the Vale, the Westerlands, the Riverlands, and elsewhere.
In the Sworn Sword, when Sir Duncan the Tall discovers that the knight he had been serving had fought for Daemon Blackfyre, he thinks that during the rebellion, half the realm was for the Red Dragon and half was for the Black. While no one has taken an exact survey, this is repeated often enough that it's likely a close approximation of truth, at least in the regions that were involved in the fighting. And as we just heard in the quote from the World Book, many battles were fought between Black and Red Dragons in the Vale, the Westerlands, the Riverlands, and elsewhere.
Since, as we've mentioned, none of the paramount houses declared for Daemon, it's probably safe to assume that some of those initial battles were regional clashes in which the Lords Paramount attempted to quash their local rebels. As to why these skirmishes were breaking out simultaneously across the realm, we wonder if the locals were being encouraged or supported by a network of Daemon's supporters traveling the realm and fomenting rebellion. And what we hear about Sir Quentyn Ball's activities certainly implies that this could be the case.
Quentyn Ball, as we mentioned in the last segment, had been the Master-at-Arms of the Red Keep, and he had his own personal grievance against King Daeron. In the Mystery Night, Prince Aegon tells Duncan about Sir Quentin's past and includes the following. He taught my father and my uncles how to fight, the great bastards too. My father says that it was Fireball as much as Bittersteel who convinced Daemon Blackfyre to claim the crown and rescued him when Daeron sent the Kingsguard to arrest him.
Egg goes on to tell Dunk how Fireball defeated Lord Lefford, one of the Lannisters' main bannermen, at the gates of Lannisport, and then, quote, sent the Grey Lion running back to hide inside the rock. While Lord Lannister was likely supported by houses such as his wife's family, House Brax, and House Plum, whose lord was a son of Princess Aelena Targaryen, other than the Lannisters and the Leffords, no other firm loyalists from the West are specifically mentioned.
What we do hear is that in this region, Fireball was likely supported by members of houses Rain and Tarbeck, Westerland's houses who are known to have fought on both sides during the conflict. While this was well before the very famous break between House Lannister and their overmighty bannermen from Castamere and Tarbeck Hall, it's quite notable that Sir Robb Rain, said to be one of the greatest knights of the age, fought against his liege lord for Daemon.
Another great knight who fought for Daemon was known as Red Tusk, and many fans theorize that he may have been a member of another Westerlands house, House Crakehall, whose sigil features a tusked boar. If so, Red Tusk may have joined Fireball in those early battles in the Westerlands, and would have also represented a house that had members supporting both sides, with Sir Roland Crakehall being a member of Daeron's Kingsguard.
Later in the Reach, Loyalists fought rebels at a crossing of the Mander. Here Quentin Ball killed all of the sons of Lady Penrose of Parchments, save the youngest, whom he spared as a favour to the lady. House Penrose was a prominent house from the Stormlands that married into House Targaryen at least twice during the reign of Daeron II, once to his cousin, the Princess Aelena Targaryen, who married Lord Ronald Penrose and gave him 4 children, and again when Daeron's second son Aerys married the Lady Eleanor Penrose. There was also a Sir John Penrose who took part in the tourney at Ashford Meadow in 209 AC, who we speculate may have been the young son who was spared by Fireball at the Mander.
And as an aside, George has confirmed that Eleanor Penrose was a cousin of her husband Aerys Targaryen, but not through Princess Aelena, so there is at least one other Targaryen connection with House Penrose, although it is possible that that came via Lady Eleanor's maternal side and not through House Penrose directly.
The presence of House Penrose of the Stormlands at a notable battle in the Reach perhaps implies that the major houses in the Stormlands remained loyal to Daeron. And indeed, in addition to their familial connection with the Penroses, we also have Prince Baelor, Daeron's eldest son, married to Lady Jenna Dondarrion, a member of a prominent Marcher house. House Baratheon, with a history of family connections with the ruling house stretching back to their founder, Lord Orys, is also presumed to have been loyal to Daeron.
However, due to Daeron's supporters' leveraging of the Dornish issue, it's noted that much of his support came from the Marcher regions, which includes the borderlands of the Stormlands with Dorne. Because, as we've said, many of the prominent houses from this region are noted to have connections with the royal family and seem to be firmly in their camp in the years following Daemon's rebellion, we presume that the skirmishes in this region were fought between those larger houses and some of their liegemen.
But this may also be where the curious case of House Ironwood came into play. The Ironwoods were longtime rivals of House Martell and were reckoned to be the second most powerful house in Dorne. House Will, who imprisoned Aemon the Dragon Knight, leading to Baelor the Blessed's famous rescue of his cousin following Daeron I's disastrous war against Dorne, are among their bannermen. For unspecified reasons, which we can guess are related to dissatisfaction with a peace forged by Baelor and Daeron with House Martell, the Ironwoods became powerful supporters of Daemon Blackfyre. and so it seems highly likely that the early battles fought in the Stormlands involved loyalists fighting against both dissatisfied marcher houses and the historic foes on the Dornish side, such as the Ironwoods and their liegemen. As Shakespeare said in The Tempest, misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows. Or, to put it more bluntly, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Over in the Reach, we know that Leo Longthorn Tyrell led the Loyalists in notable victories supported by houses such as Caswell, Weber, Hightower, and Oakhart, though, as we said earlier, members of the latter two houses also fought with the rebels. Opposing them were numerous Marcher lords from the region, including Lord Gorman Peake, possibly Lord Cockshaw, and other unnamed houses who joined the rebels primarily due to their anti-Dornish sentiment. They were joined by lords from further north in the Reach, such as Sir Aubrey Ambrose, who is liegeman to Lord Leo. Lord Custane likely joined those members of his liege lord from House Hightower who were fighting for the rebels, and finally there were Sir Eustace Osgrey of Standfast, whose own liege, Lord Rowan, was a likely loyalist, along with a knight of the Reach known only as Blackfyre Flowers, whom Sir Eustace seemed to think was one of the main heroes of Daemon's cause.
In the Vale, once again the Lord Paramount remained loyal to Daeron. Lord Donal Arryn was joined by the Knight of Nine Stars from House Templeton and Wild Will Waynwood in fighting against rebels in their region. While there may have been numerous smaller houses who declared for Daemon, the main notable Blackfyre supporters from this region seem to have been the Sistermen led by Lord Sunderland.
House Sunderland and the Sistermen in general have a very interesting history that's worth noting here, since it might have a strong bearing on why they chose to support the Blackfyre cause. The Sistermen were first men who established themselves as pirate kings on their three islands long before the Andal invasion that changed the Vale forever. They never adopted the religion of the old gods, as their fellow first men did, but instead maintained a reverence for the Lady of the Waves and the Lord of the Skies right up to the days of the Andals and very likely beyond.
Raiders from the Sisters are known to have frequently attacked the north, which in turn led to brutal retaliatory raids by Northmen, including under King Theon Stark. After being defeated in an invasion known as the Rape of the Three Sisters, the islanders turned to House Arryn for support. Renouncing their claim to kingship, they bent the knee to King Mathos Arryn II in return for support in ousting the Northmen. What followed was a centuries-long war of attrition, known as the War Across the Water, which ultimately left the Sisters diminished and firmly beholden to House Arryn.
In A Dance with Dragons, Lord Godric Borrell, Lord of Sweet Sister, tells Davos Seaworth, "The maesters say the rape of the three sisters was 2,000 years ago, but Sisterton has not forgotten." And so if we look back a mere 3 centuries to what was going on in the Sisters during the days of Aegon's conquest, we find the Sistermen taking advantage of local instability by rebelling against their longtime liege lords, the Kings of the Vale, and naming their own leader, Lady Marla Sunderland, as Queen of the Sisters during their Sistermen's Rebellion.
That particular rebellion ended when Queen Visenya Targaryen was sent with Vhagar to take control of the islands. Queen Marla was deposed by her family, and her brother yielded the islands to House Targaryen with minimal bloodshed. Hostages were given, and Marla Sunderland had her tongue removed and was forced to join the Silent Sisters.
Several generations later, the Sunderlands pledged their support to Rhaenyra Targaryen when her son, Jacaerys Valerian, flew to the islands on Vermax during the Dance of the Dragons. Then, just 60 years later, Lord Godric tells Davos Seaworth the Sunderlands dragged the sisters into 2 of the Blackfyre Rebellions, and we all suffered grievously for that. He also goes on to say, "These kings never bother with the sisters. Why should they? We're small and poor." Overall, Lord Godric's words hint at a long memory and a sense of pique over their reduced circumstances and growing irrelevance. And so we wonder if perhaps gaining the support of these contentious islanders might actually have been as easy as visiting them and asking, just as Jace Valerian had done.
Meanwhile, in the Riverlands, House Tully led loyalists, who included Lords Darry and Smallwood, and of course the Blackwoods, in fighting against Daemon's supporters. Here things became a bit more complex, and much of it may have been due to the legacy of Aegon the Unworthy.
We know about the famous rivalry between Bittersteel and Bloodraven, two of the great bastards who were born into the famously oppositional houses, Bracken and Blackwood. Bittersteel, as we said, was perhaps the most influential supporter of Daemon Blackfyre, and early in the rebellion, the current lord of House Bracken, who was likely to be Bittersteel's uncle, that is, the son of the executed hand of Aegon the Unworthy, and brother to both Barba and Bethany, his mistresses, took ship across the narrow sea to hire sellswords for Daemon's cause, and more on that later.
But the Riverlands was also home to House Butterwell, whose current lord, Ambrose, had been Aegon IV's Master of Coin and was currently Daeron's hand, though, spoiler alert, not for long, since his leadership would prove so ineffective that many began to whisper that he secretly supported Daemon. He was ultimately replaced not long into the conflict. His eldest son remained a loyalist, but at some point his second son joined Daemon's cause. Notably, all three of his daughters were married to Blackfyre supporters, and so the history of House Butterwell is worth reviewing.
Lord Ambrose's grandfather had, in his own day, served as hand to Aegon IV, and it was he who had built their great castle, White Walls, out of white marble from the Vale and with rafters carved from weirwoods. Although buildings and objects made using weirwoods are not unknown, due to the first men's reverence of the sacred trees, we do have to wonder if cutting them down was not necessarily viewed favorably by any local worshippers of the old gods, especially House Blackwood, whose own long-dead and petrified heart tree has been maintained with reverence for centuries.
As we mentioned previously, at some point during his service as hand, the king came to stay at White Walls. Aegon, famous for his carnal appetites, took one look at the three maiden daughters of his host and offered the hand a priceless dragon egg in exchange for access to all three girls for one night. The hand, of course, agreed, and it was said that by the time the king departed the next day, all three Butterwell daughters had royal bastards on the way. Since all the nobly born bastards of Aegon the Unworthy are collectively known as the Great Bastards, and these three alleged children are never mentioned outside of this story, one could certainly doubt its veracity.
However, other possibilities exist, any one of which may have contributed to a certain resentment among members of House Butterwell. For instance, mothers and/or children could have died in childbirth, or perhaps pregnant daughters were hastily married off to resentful partners. Any amount of shame, bad luck, or ill fortune could have followed these three young women as a result of Aegon's bargain with their father, leading to that most poisonous of feelings, grievance.
Fast forward to Lord Ambrose's day, we do eventually see the man and his famous draconic heirloom on page, at which point we also see him to be both indecisive and faint-hearted. Bloodraven calls him Craven, and we think that in these first days of Daemon's rebellion, ineffective is probably the kindest thing that could be said of the man. And recall, one of Lord Butterwell's younger daughters was eventually married to a son of Lord Costaigne from the Reach, who we've mentioned fought for Daemon, while another was wed to Lord Risley, also from the Reach, who is supposed to have been for the Black Dragon based on the company he kept. Meanwhile, in the Riverlands, his eldest daughter was married to one Tomard Heddle.
Heddle was descended from a knight known as Long John Heddle, who had settled down as a proprietor of the inn at the crossroads, then known as either the Two Crowns or the Bellringer Inn. When Long John took up ironworking as a hobby, long before the days of Daemon's rebellion, he wrought a three-headed dragon sign of black iron to hang in the inn's dooryard. Afterwards, the inn became known as the Clanking Dragon for the sounds the jointed parts of the iron sign made as it swayed in the wind.
When Daemon called his supporters to rebel, Long John's son was an old man, still the proprietor of the inn. Black Tom Heddle, who married Lord Butwell's youngest daughter, was presumably a family member of this man. Early in the conflict, Lord Darry, the local overlord and a prominent supporter of Daeron, happened to pass by the inn and notice the black iron dragon clanking in its courtyard. Becoming wroth over what appeared to be a symbol of Daemon Blackfyre hanging on his lands, Lord Darry cut the sign down and flung it into the Trident.
Incidentally, years later, that very iron dragon would wash up on the shores of the Quiet Isle, red with rust, a symbol that leads some readers of the main story to suppose that one day a dragon will wash up on the shores of Westeros, who appears to be red, but beneath the surface is in actuality black. And of course, this forms part of the basis of the fake Aegon Targaryen theory in the main series.
And in that, we are getting very far ahead of ourselves, though. Suffice it to say that in 196 AC, whether because of a sense of grievance over Lord Darry's actions or some other reason, it seems very likely that at least one member of the Heddle family, Sir Tom, supported Daemon Blackfyre.
And then there's House Lothston. We've already mentioned Lord Lucas Lothston and his wife, Lady Felaena Stokeworth, but let's dig a little deeper. Felaena was married off to Lucas Lothston in 151 AC during the reign of Aegon III, after his hand, Prince Viserys, discovered her in bed with his son, Prince Aegon. Lady Felaena and her husband would later return to court with their daughter, a young maiden, said by some to be Aegon's daughter. This was nearly 27 years later, though, and the girl Jane was a mere teenager. While it's certainly possible that Aegon had continued to enjoy Lord Lothston's wife over the years, we find it much more likely and certainly more interesting to consider the possibility that Lord Lucas, who had become known as the Pander for his obsequiousness with King Aegon, wasn't actually the true father to his eldest son and heir, Manfred.
Yeah, the hasty marriage of Lady Felaena Stokeworth to Lucas Lothston, who was the grandson of a hedge knight and master-at-arms of the Red Keep, was conspicuously accompanied by the gift of the castle of Harrenhal, the greatest castle in the Riverlands, that had been empty since the extinction of House Strong during the Dance of the Dragons some 20 years previously. It was a handsome gift to give a knight of little standing just for taking a sullied wife, and in most circumstances one would think a holding of lesser significance might have been sufficient.
Of course, Harrenhal has a very dark reputation, and its lack of occupants may have been a problem for Aegon and Viserys. And considering the death of their father nearby, perhaps they simply wanted to be rid of the place. But it would also have come with a very hefty bill for maintenance and restoration to a habitable state, which implies that there may have been a significant monetary reward that accompanied the wife and castle as well.
And so we think the much more likely scenario is that Lucas Lothston was given Harrenhal and the healthy income required to support it in exchange for not only taking Lady Felaena to wife, but also the royal bastard that she may have brought with her, along with his silence on the matter. This would make Sir Manfred Lothston, who took part in Daemon's rebellion, potentially the half-brother of not only King Daeron, but of Daemon Blackfyre.
In A Feast for Crows, we hear about a Manfred Lothston, known as Manfred of the Black Hood, who was guilty of foul deeds. And in The Sworn Sword, Sir Eustace Osprey bemoans that Manfred Lothston betrayed Daemon. And so the supposition is that Sir Manfred initially supported Daemon, but betrayed him in the end. And certainly in the decades following Daemon's rebellion, it appears that House Lothston is once again on the Loyalist side.
Other Riverlanders who supported Daemon are House Shawnee, who, based on their arms bearing bars of red, blue, and green, seem to be from the area of the Trident, and may have been sworn to House Bracken, especially considering their close positioning with Bittersteel at one of the notable battles. There are also several houses of uncertain loyalty whom we think were likely maintaining a foot in both camps, the first and foremost of which is House Frey.
The phrase, as we know from the main story and its recent history, could be reluctant to commit to a rebellious cause. However, this reluctance did not seem to be evident during the Dance of the Dragons when Lord Forest Frey was a prominent supporter of Rhaenyra, and we suspect that that support, which led to Lord Forest's death, may have actually proved to be the source of future Lords Frey being reluctant to get involved in the quarrels of their royal overlords.
And so, while Lord Frey, along with his son Sir Franklin and nephew Sir Adam, as well as his liegemen from houses Nayland and Charlton, appear to have been at least in some measure involved in the second Blackfyre Rebellion 15 years into the future, their presence at the Ashford tourney a few years previously might suggest a loyalist vein as well. Of course, we have to keep in mind the meta-reality that when George wrote the Ashford tourney, House Blackfyre didn't exist yet.
Nonetheless, we suggest that since George did eventually place Freys at the Second Blackfyre Rebellion at White Walls, like their neighbors of House Butterwell and other prominent houses from both Westerlands and Reach, House Frey was indeed meant to be a both-sideser, hedging their bets in a manner worthy of the late Lord Frey, as Lord Hoster Tully would famously name the overcautious Lord Walder in the prelude to the main series.
Of course, whenever we discuss the Riverlands during this period, we must always come back to where we started, the rivalry between Bittersteel and Bloodraven. In A Dance with Dragons, Brynden Rivers will tell his young protege, Bran Stark, "I have my own ghosts, Bran, a brother that I loved, a brother that I hated, and a woman I desired." Many readers presume this to refer to none other than Daemon Blackfyre, Bittersteel, and Shiera Seastar.
Yeah, Bloodraven, loving not only his half-sister Shiera, who famously gave him her bed but not her hand, but his elder half-brother Daemon as well, seems very much in keeping with the tragic family story George is telling. Whether you agree with that or not, there can be no doubt, though, that the brother he hated was Aegor Rivers, Bittersteel, who had been raised by his Bracken family to hate not only his Targaryen relatives, but his half-siblings of House Blackwood as well.
As we've mentioned several times, Bittersteel is considered largely responsible for Daemon making the decision to rebel, while conversely, Bloodraven is thought to have been the one who discovered the plot and notified his brother the king, leading to Daeron sending the Kingsguard to arrest Daemon, which was only foiled through the heroic efforts of Sir Quentyn Ball smuggling Daemon out of the Red Keep.
This dramatic escape would prove to be a convenient tale for the propagandists working for Daemon's cause. As we said, many people would hear a version of the story in which Daemon was completely innocent and that Daeron had acted out of baseless fear. This was a useful fable for fomenting the war that Daemon's close allies desired, and many others began to once again spread the rumor that had first been heard during Aegon IV's day, that Daeron Falseborn, as they called him, was the son of the Dragon Knight, not Aegon himself.
We don't know exactly where Daemon went after he escaped from King's Landing, but recall that Daeron had granted his younger brother land along the Blackwater on the occasion of his wedding to Rohan of Tyrosh. It's very possible that Daemon had indeed built a keep somewhere to the west of the city in the intervening years, and we can surmise that wherever he went, it was a sufficiently safe base of operations from which he was able to direct his network of supporters.
Indeed, Damon had at least 9 children who seem to have been raised somewhere in the Reach, so that would fit, and some of whom were actually still quite young in 196. Considering his wife and many of his children ultimately fled to Essos, they had to have been in safe territory or close enough to allies that they were able to do so without being captured. Additionally, we know that Daemon minted coinage during his brief reign. Even though this was probably largely symbolic, the ability to do so at all indicates an adequately stable base of operations, not to mention funding.
One thing Daemon never did was have himself crowned. There is a hint that perhaps he planned to do so in the mention of a plot to steal dragon eggs from the family treasury. Once again, our source is Sir Eustace Osgrey, who in the Sworn Sword bemoans, "If Quickfinger had not been caught with the stolen dragon's eggs." In the Mystery Knight, Egg makes it clear that only legitimate members of House Targaryen were given cradle eggs, so this would have been one potent symbol of legitimacy that Daemon was lacking. The fact that the plot apparently involved stealing multiple eggs perhaps indicates that not only was Daemon seeking one for himself, but perhaps he intended to see his children, or at least his heir, also in possession of one of these valuable Targaryen heirlooms.
Yeah, the fact that Sir Eustace considers this one of the many ifs that might have turned the tide for Daemon speaks to the importance of the symbolism of possessing such things, and we find it extremely plausible that once in possession of the ancestral sword and a dragon's egg, Daemon's next move would have been to have himself crowned. While we can't say whether he planned to wait until a major victory left him in a position to actually be crowned in King's Landing, or would have done so immediately, as we've seen in other eras of Targaryen history, even a crowning away from the Iron Throne can be potently symbolic.
As for the failure of the egg plot and the capture of the thief known to us only as Quickfinger, we believe that is also probably the work of none other than Bloodraven, who had already proved so useful as an intelligence gatherer and would become known as an almost preternatural spy during the reigns of Aerys I and Maekar. And speaking of Bloodraven, before we move on to covering the climactic and decisive battle of Daemon's Rebellion, let's look at a major event that many agree may have turned the tide in the Loyalists' favour.
We've talked about Quentin Ball and his role as a war leader early in the rebellion. He led Daemon's forces in multiple engagements across multiple regions of the realm and almost always seems to have won the day. Not only was he a superior warrior, but as Master of Arms at the Red Keep, he was the warrior that had trained an entire generation of princes in the art of war. That means that he knew his opponents, Daeron's sons, Baelor and Maekar, who were leading the Loyalist armies, as well as Bloodraven, intimately.
The flip side of that is that they knew him, of course, and we wonder if that might have been his undoing. Because another item of the list of events that Sir Eustace Osgrey mentions that might have changed the tide of history is if Fireball had not been slain on the eve of battle. In the Mystery Knight, Egg explains to Dunk that Fireball died before the Redgrass Field, telling him an archer put an arrow through his throat as he dismounted by a stream to have a drink. Just some common man, no one knows who.
Now, Egg might not have known exactly who was responsible for Fireball's death, and perhaps even those who suspected the truth may have been afraid to speak of it after the battle, but we readers can certainly guess. As we'll see, Brynden Rivers, even in this time when he was not yet the king's hand, possessed a personal guard who were known as the Raven's Teeth, and those guards were longbowmen who were equipped with weirwood bows.
Additionally, he was a noted archer himself, with George saying in 2005, although he bears the Valyrian blade Dark Sister that once belonged to Aegon's Visenya, his favourite weapon is a tall, bone-white weirwood longbow. He is an expert bowman. And so when the main war leader of the rebel cause just happened to be brought down by an anonymous archer at a critical moment in the rebellion, it seems not only plausible but highly likely that the random archer was either in the employ of Bloodraven or perhaps even the man himself. Certainly over the course of this tale, we'll see he was not above using the most pragmatic means necessary to gain the upper hand for the cause he supported.
And on that note, we leave the rebels on the eve of battle, now missing their main war leader, but certainly not without other famous and able warriors to take his place. When we return, we'll cover every detail we know about the Battle of the Redgrass Field.
The rebellion ended at the Redgrass Field nigh on a year later. Some have written of the boldness of the men who fought with Daemon, and others of their treason. But for all their valour in the field and their enmity against Daeron, theirs was a lost cause.
No one knows exactly where the climactic battle took place. We only know it by the name it was given afterwards, the Battle of the Redgrass Field. Since that name was based on the blood that saturated the field after the battle, none can say what it might have been called before, but many suspect that it was somewhere in the area where the Crownlands, Riverlands, and Reach came together along the northern reaches of the Blackwater, which might have been quite close to Daemon's base, if indeed that was located on the lands that had been given to him by his brother upon his marriage.
While George has never identified exactly where the battle site that would come to be known as the Redgrass Field was, and more on that shortly, neither do we know specifically why a battle was fought there at that time. Was Daemon marching to the capital, or did the Loyalists decide to bring the battle to him? If we had to guess, we'd say it was likely a pitched battle forced by Daeron's new hand, Lord Hayford, in order to take advantage of a number of circumstances, the first of which would have been the recent death of Quentyn Ball.
And second would have been the imminent return of Lord Bracken from Essos with sellswords to bolster Daemon's ranks. There may have also been some momentum for the Loyalists following the capture of the thief Quickfinger and whatever betrayal Manfred Lothston was guilty of. Finally, with numerous prominent lords openly supporting both sides, it may have been decided that a decisive action was necessary before the balance started to tilt towards Daemon.
As Sir Eustace Osgrey bemoans in The Sworn Sword, so many ifs, sir. Had any one come out differently, it could all have turned t'other way. So indeed the fate of the realm seems to have been truly hanging by a thread when Lord Bracken's return was delayed by storms and Fireball was killed.
Even with the weight of circumstances being slightly in favor of the Loyalists, it would still be a close thing. We learn after the fact that Lord Leo Tyrell was unable to assemble his own army in time, which supports the idea of a planned rather than a chance battle. And as we'll see, there's one dramatic circumstance that eventually turned the tide of the battle that would have been known to Loyalist tacticians and could very well have contributed to the timing of this set piece.
Speaking of Loyalist tacticians, not long before the climactic battle of the rebellion, Lord Ambrose Butterwell was replaced as Hand of the King by Lord Hayford, a Crownlander who had been stalwart from the first, as opposed to what we imagine to be Lord Butterwell's dithering. Even according to Blackfyre supporter Sir Eustace Osgrey, Butterwell had done such a dismal job that many questioned his loyalty. And as we said, he also had a son in each camp, so we do know that the Loyalist commander was likely the Hand Lord Hayford, assisted by several royal princes, as well as at least one Lord Paramount.
We don't know anything specific about the weather on the day of the battle, though Sir Eustace Osgrey speaks eloquently of the beautiful sunset at the end of the day. That, coupled with the fact that there's no mention of mud or any other significant challenge of terrain or conditions, leads us to believe that the battle took place on a relatively fair day under sunny skies and following a stretch of dry weather. And based on the fact that there's also no mention of either side taking advantage of the sun blinding their opponents, as well as that one circumstance which would turn the tide at its end, we can further surmise that the battlefield was positioned on a roughly north-south axis, with Daeron's army on the northern side and Daemon's positioned to the south.
Additionally, based on everything we know, it turns out we can actually put forth a pretty reasonable guess at the location. Due to Baelor Breakspear's arrival at just the right moment from the south, we think the field would likely have been south of the Blackwater and northwest of the Kingswood, which just so happens to correspond with a neighbourhood of Daemon's supposed keep, as well as being more or less directly south of Lord Hayford's lands on the north bank of the Blackwater. The fact that the royal army would have had to fully cross the Blackwater also supports the idea of a planned or pitched battle rather than a chance encounter on the march, while a location south of the river places us very near to the intersection of the Rose Road and the King's Road, which agrees with Eustace Osgrey's remark to Dunk in the Swan Sword that had Daemon's army won the day, they would have had the road to King's Landing open before them.
As far as the positioning of the armies, in the Mystery Night, Egg tells Dunk that Lord Costaigne from the Reach was on Daemon's left, while Bittersteel had the right, with at least one of the rebellious river lords. On the opposing side, we know that Lord Arryn had the vanguard, and that Prince Maekar Targaryen was positioned on the left of the main battle. From context clues, we'd place Lord Hayford in command of the main battle, and Bloodraven either on the right flank or the rear, from where he was able to deploy his archers to take advantage of the available high ground known as the Weeping Ridge, about 300 yards from, but significantly higher than, the main battlefield.
Interestingly, the fact that Daemon's side was arrayed in a line formation, left, centre, right, while the Loyalists appear to have been in column formation, is yet another factor supporting the idea that this was a battle of Lord Hayford's choosing. Daemon's line formation indicates defence, while a column is highly indicative of an offensive charge. Supporting this is the fact that it appears that both Daemon's centre and Lord Arryn's vanguard were a horse, suggesting an initial cavalry charge was the move upon which both sides' hopes were hung.
The presence of a ridge behind the Loyalists, as well as their use of column formation, also suggests that they were taking significant advantage of terrain and didn't feel vulnerable to flanking maneuvers by their enemy. Rather, the main battle would be positioned with great depth in such a way as to hold the enemy's center, and note the apparent intent there.
On the other hand, the defenders would have made every effort to take advantage of the width of the field to block the advance of Daeron's men, and a defensive formation makes a lot of sense if we're correct that Daemon's base of operations was nearby. In either case, the hope would be to break the opponent's centre, or conversely to shatter the vanguard with a cavalry charge in order to divide the opposing force into smaller groups that could be encircled and defeated piecemeal.
In the first instant, it seems that the battle was actually going Daemon's way. Once again, our eyewitness account from Sir Eustace Osgrey tells the tale. Daemon was the warrior himself that day. No man could stand before him. He broke Lord Arryn's van to pieces and slew the Knight of Nine Stars and Wild Will Waynwood before coming up against Sir Gawain Corbray of the Kingsguard. For near an hour they danced together on their horses, wheeling and circling and slashing as men died all around them.
So in the initial charge, Daemon's centre won out, while his duel with Sir Gawain Corbray played out with both on horseback. We know that many other knights dismounted and took their swords and maces directly to the foe. If we're correct about rough division of left and right on Daemon's side being Reach and Riverlands, we see Lords Costain and Peake on Daemon's left making inroads against the right flank of Lord Hayford's main battle, with Lord Peake striking down the hand, as well as Sir Arlen of Pennytree's squire Roger and Sir Buford Bulwer killing what he claimed were dozens of loyalists.
On the right with Bittersteel, Lord Shawnee was gravely wounded and Lord Butterwell's second son was killed. At some point, Lord Wyman Webber's squire was ridden down by a knight, suggesting that he was on foot and perhaps in line with the enemy's right battle after the initial charge took place. Incidentally, the presence of squires in the midst of this battle indicates that many knights had dismounted after the initial charge to carry out their fighting on foot, with the squires being in charge of removing the horses from the field.
In the midst of the chaos, Daemon's duel with Gawain Corbray continued. Again, Sir Eustace continues the tale. It's said that whenever Blackfyre and Lady Forlorn clashed, you could hear the sound for a league around. It was half a song and half a scream, they say, but when at last the lady faltered, Blackfyre clove through Sir Gawain's helm and left him blind and bleeding.
And then Daemon made what his supporters saw in hindsight as a fatal mistake. Having so far faced his foe from horseback, he dismounted to see that Corbray wasn't trampled and had Red Tusk carry him to the maesters at his rear. While this type of honorable treatment wasn't unknown amongst knights on the battlefield, and see Robert Baratheon having Sir Barristan Selmy cared for by his own maester at the Battle of the Trident, in this case, honor would prove to be Daemon's doom.
Unbeknownst to Daemon, his half-brother Bloodraven had gained the ridge about 300 yards away with his archers behind Daeron's entire army, but at sufficient height to have a clear view of Daemon's standard, with Daemon and his 12-year-old twins, likely acting as their father's squires, clearly in view beneath it. It's said that Bloodraven himself targeted Aegon, the eldest of the twins, knowing that his brother would attempt to shield his sons.
And, true to expectations, when Aegon fell, Daemon stood firm, though he soon came under a hail of white arrows. Sir Eustace says disdainfully that those arrows were driven as much by sorcery as by Bloodraven's bow. But in truth, he was well in range of longbow fire, and such a hail of arrows couldn't have come only from Bloodraven. His raven's teeth may have numbered anywhere from 50 to 100 longbowmen armed with weirwood bows, and under their direct attack, Daemon was pierced by no fewer than 7 bolts.
When his father fell, the younger twin Aemon took up Blackfyre and, with the famed Targaryen sword in his hand, was killed in his turn by another white arrow. With Daemon's fall, the battle was nearly turned to a rout. The centre broke and rebels began to run, but then Bittersteel came from the right to turn the rout. Picking up Daemon's sword, he led a charge characterized as mad, with Blackfyre in hand, aimed directly at his hated younger brother Bloodraven.
Bearing in mind that Bloodraven had been at the rear of the Loyalist army with his archers, this was a mad charge indeed. Eustace Osgrey tells us that when Bittersteel confronted Bloodraven with the sword of the Conqueror, it was a duel, quote, second only to the one Daemon fought with Gawain Corbray. Blackfyre battled Dark Sister, with Bloodraven losing an eye to his brother's sword, but ultimately it was Bittersteel who fled the field, though whether it was Bloodraven's sword from which he fled, or from the certainty of doom he suddenly saw on the field behind him, we cannot say.
For as the two half-brothers battled with their storied Valyrian steel swords, Prince Baelor Targaryen had appeared at the rebels' rear, leading an army of Stormlanders and Dornish spearmen up from the south. Sir Eustace describes seeing Prince Baelor's hammer blow against the rear, the Dornish men all screaming as they filled the air with spears.
While Baelor struck the rebel rear, his younger brother Maekar rallied the loyalist center to stand fast and serve as an anvil to his brother's sudden and entirely unexpected hammer blow. It was the depth of the loyalist column formation and the evident discipline of the royal troops that allowed this hammer and anvil maneuver to succeed, which suggests that it was not accidental or fortuitous at all, but exceedingly well planned out.
Yeah, as we suggested at the outset, the precision timing of the maneuver, combined with what appears to be the loyalist choice of bringing the battle to the rebels and the use of column formation, all point towards the royal commander's intent. While Sir Eustace Osgrey comforts himself with his litany of ifs, including if Daemon had ridden over Gwaine Corbray and left him to his fate, he might have broken Maekar's left before Bloodraven could take the ridge, there are certainly factors that hint at much more design than the singers and maesters perhaps credit. Remember, while every one of the factors cited by Sir Eustace may have appeared to him as ill chance, that does not prevent most of them actually being the result of an exceedingly well thought out plan of battle by the loyalist commanders.
Sir Eustace does make one excellent point, though, when he says, "At the end of the day, it made no matter. The war was done when Daemon died." Without Daemon, or even his eldest sons, the Blackfyre supporters had no cause. Daemon's next son was still a very young boy, only 7 years old, though he and his siblings would be swiftly whisked away to Essos for safekeeping by Bittersteel. For now, the Blackfyre cause had ended.
10,000 men perished along with Daemon Blackfyre and his sons. As Maester Yandel tells it, those men died for Daemon Blackfyre's vanity, though of course Sir Eustace viewed it quite differently. Had just one or two things gone differently, he believed, quote, "We would be called the Loyalists, and the Red Dragons would be remembered as men who fought to keep the usurper, Daeron the Falseborn, upon his stolen throne, and failed."
With so many dead, and even more wounded, and the realm cloven in two by the second Targaryen civil war in a century, there would be a long road to healing, if healing were even possible. And on that note, we leave this section with Eustace Osgrey's description of the aftermath on that field of blood-soaked grass.
A great battle is a terrible thing, but in the midst of blood and carnage, there is sometimes also beauty that could break your heart. I will never forget the way the sun looked when it set upon the Redgrass Field. 10,000 men had died, and the air was thick with moans and lamentations. But above us, the sky turned gold and red and orange, so beautiful it made me weep to know that my sons would never see it.
In the aftermath of the royal victory at the Redgrass Field, the rebels were divided into two groups, those who remained and bent their knees, and those who refused and fled across the narrow sea. The latter group was led by Bittersteel, who in the immediate aftermath took Daemon's wife and surviving children to Tyrosh, presumably to Lady Rohan's family there, and more on this group shortly.
For now, let's focus on those who chose to remain and the reasons why they did so. The World Book tells us that, in the aftermath, King Daeron showed a sternness that few expected. Many lords and knights who had supported the Black Dragon had lands and seats and privileges stripped from them and were forced to give over hostages. It is possible that sternness came from the king's advisers, for after Lord Hayford's death in the battle, a new hand was named.
The king's son and heir, Baelor Breakspear, was the new hand, and though he was known to be as just and open-handed as his father, he had also participated in the recent battle and saw the impact firsthand, 10,000 dead and even more maimed and wounded. Many of the casualties were men his father had known and trusted, and yet had still chosen to support Daemon.
Nonetheless, some 15 years later, Daeron's grandson Aegon, who wasn't born until several years after the battle, would tell Sir Duncan, "Sometimes at court I would serve the king's small council. They used to fight about it. Uncle Baelor said that clemency was best when dealing with an honorable foe. If a defeated man believes he will be pardoned, he may lay down his sword and bend the knee. Elsewise, he will fight on to the death and slay more loyal men and innocents. But Lord Bloodraven said that when you pardon rebels, you only plant the seeds of the next rebellion."
And so we get a small window into what the likely positions of Daeron's counselors were in 196 AC. With some counselors advising clemency and others the opposite, it's probably not surprising that Daeron and ultimately Baelor chose a middle path. Daeron himself must have felt personally affronted by some of the rebels, but he no doubt saw the wisdom in his son's words about clemency. At the same time, Baelor had seen the results of Daemon's revolt firsthand, and it could not be denied that Daeron's natural generosity had thus far proved to make him appear weak in some men's eyes. And so they must have known that an example of those lords who had chosen rebellion over loyalty must be made.
Yet not to mention that Daeron was probably advised that he must reward those who had remained loyal. And so we see men like Lord Gorman Peake deprived of 2 of his 3 castles, while Sir Eustace Osgrey lost lands and water rights. We don't know to whom the Peake castles were awarded, but do know that the lands and water rights taken from Osgrey were awarded to his loyalist neighbour, Lord Wyman Webber, and can probably assume that the same pattern was repeated across the realm.
It wasn't just lands that were taken, though. As was customary with rebel lords, hostages were demanded by the crown. Once again, we know the most about Sir Eustace Osgrey, whose daughter was taken as hostage. In The Sworn Sword, he tells Dunk, "I bought my head back with my daughter's life." While his practice of taking hostages sometimes ended with the hostage being released when they attained adulthood or when their family had paid sufficiently in gold, lands, or time, in Sir Eustace's case, there was no happy ending.
His daughter Alysanne ended up being given to the Silent Sisters, and when he attempted to visit her in the capital years later, she either couldn't or wouldn't speak with him. She died in the Great Spring Sickness 13 years after her father took up arms against his king at age 20. In another tragic twist, with all 3 of her sons dead at the Redgrass Field and a daughter taken from her, we also learned that Sir Eustace's wife threw herself from the top of Standfast Tower.
While Sir Eustace's case may have been a tragic extreme, we cannot doubt that across the realm there were families who were not only torn apart by the rebellion, but by its aftermath as well, as lands, fortunes, and families were sacrificed in order to bring rebel lords and knights back into the king's good graces. In truth, this kind of clemency was not exactly what Prince Baelor had advocated for, and while on the surface allowing rebels to return to the king's peace may have appeared to be mercy, underneath and in practice, it was much more akin to the scorched earth recommended by the king's half-brother Brynden Rivers.
Many of those who took up arms for Daemon managed to keep their heads down and blend in, at least in the decade or so immediately following the rebellion. In The Sworn Sword, 15 years later, Dunk thinks, until this moment he had never met a man who'd fought for the Pretender. I must have, though. There were thousands of them. Half the realm was for the Red Dragon and half was for the Black. And so a fragile peace was forged, with Maester Yandel telling us in the World Book, with his half-brothers dealt with and the strength of his sons and heirs supporting him, many thought that King Daeron had now ensured that the realm would be under Targaryen rule for centuries to come.
But of course, that viewpoint is quite optimistic and ignores the half-brother that had not been dealt with and had simply fled to sanctuary in Essos. As we said, Bittersteel took Daemon's widow and children to Tyrosh, and in this flight he was accompanied by hundreds of knights and lords whose devotion to Daemon's cause, or perhaps more pertinently, whose opposition to Daeron, was so strong that they left everything behind in Westeros for the life of exiles and sellswords in Essos.
Among these were families such as the Stricklands, who lost everything due to their support of Daemon. And there may have also been Toynes, Coles, Mandrakes, Lostons, and Mudds among this group. Whoever made up their number, there were certainly scores of them, and in the first months and years after fleeing Westeros, they inevitably began to sell their swords to companies like the Ragged Standard, the Second Sons, or the Maiden's Men.
And it was this dilution of House Blackfyre's supporters that led Bittersteel to found his own company of sellswords to give the exiles a place to stay together. The Golden Company soon became known as one of the more honorable sellsword companies and gained a reputation for never breaking a contract, earning their motto, "Our word is good as gold," through years of discipline and well-paid work around the disputed lands.
And their dedication to honor was proved to be a two-way street early on. When the Free City of Qohor refused to honor a contract with the Golden Company in its early years, they sacked the city in revenge. Simply put, it soon became obvious that if you did not mess with the Golden Company, they would serve you efficiently and with honor, though at a price, of course.
The formation of what amounted to a standing army led by Bittersteel and based around the surviving members of the Blackfyre family was certainly not viewed with approval from Westeros, and in The Sworn Sword and The Mystery Knight, we hear that, quote, Bittersteel and the sons of Daemon Blackfyre are hatching plots in Tyrosh, and that Bloodraven's remaining eye was, quote, fixed on Tyrosh, where Bittersteel sits in exile, plotting with the sons of Daemon Blackfyre.
While Stannis Baratheon, in the Theon Winds of Winter sample chapter, seems pretty confident that the wind that blows exiles across the narrow sea seldom blows them back, he was glossing over the troubles that could arise when those exiles made the attempt anyway. And they certainly would do so, and in their efforts they would even be joined on occasion by those men who had bent the knee, but remained embittered against Daeron and his sons. These men, with wounded pride and diminished honor, often maintained secret hopes for a restoration of their dreams in their heart of hearts. As Dunk would realize about Sir Eustace Osgrey, in his heart the black dragon never died.
While the future of the Blackfyre cause must wait for another episode, before we conclude here, we want to summarize some of the major themes and meta questions that come with a study of the life of Daemon Blackfyre.
One of the things George shows very plainly in stories like The Sworn Sword and The Mystery Knight is the power of grievance for those who are on the losing side of Daemon's rebellion. We see Sir Eustace Osgrey's longing for a time past and for a reality that never existed. His melancholy over not only his personal losses, but over the lost opportunity to re-establish his house as it might have been had the preceding 200 years of Targaryen history not taken place, is real and plaintive, and this bitter nostalgia was probably repeated in tower houses and halls across the realm.
This underscores the effectiveness of the use of propaganda by Daemon's supporters, the Daeron falseborn narrative, for instance, as well as the power of a romantic fable. In A Dance with Dragons, we see that power starkly illustrated in the thoughts of none other than Sir Barristan Selmy, who at one point thinks, Daemon Blackfyre loved the first Daenerys and rose in rebellion when denied her. While we've made the case that this was very much more of an excuse than reality, the fairy story stuck and is repeated not only by contemporaries such as Sir Eustace, but much later by members of House Martell, Sir Barristan, and no doubt many more.
And on the flip side, it must be said that the book that we know as the World Book, whose conceit is that it was written by a maester of the Citadel for Robert Baratheon, is in itself essentially a work of propaganda, especially around the Blackfyre issue. It takes a distinctly royalist slant, which is no doubt largely because of Robert's direct descent from Daeron II.
And so, with perspective lost or absent, we can only look at the bare facts and make our judgment based on what we know. But of course, there's much that we don't know. We never get Daemon's viewpoint or that of anyone close to him. While the story of his rebellion is told in a dry history book, we do at least get the viewpoint of Daeron's grandson Aegon and can form a rather solid opinion of many who fought on the Loyalist side, and later in the Mystery Night, of a handful of the rebels, who, by the way, even 15 years later, still object quite strenuously to being characterized as rebels.
But in spite of the fact that we're presented a certain narrative here, there's so much missing from our perspective of Daemon that any summary of his motives is likely to be forever incomplete. Did he agree with the grievances of his advisors? Was he truly envious of his brother Daeron? Did he simply believe that his father had meant for him to succeed him? And what became of his mother, Princess Dana? Did she die before her son rose in rebellion, or did she support and encourage him, and in so doing have her name and memory forever wiped from her family's memory as a result?
Dana's a fascinating case because, as we saw with the case of Bittersteel's mother, Barbara Bracken, it wasn't at all uncommon for a woman to take the blame for a male family member's transgressions. So if Dana was alive during her son's adulthood, one would think her name would be mentioned or invoked. At the very least, her status as Aegon III's eldest surviving child might have been seen by some as strengthening her son's claim.
Instead, Daemon and his supporters seem to have leaned into the narrative suggested by Aegon IV that Daeron was the true bastard, and that the gift of the sword Blackfyre was a symbol of the prior king's true intent. In large part, this may have been because the memory of the Dance of the Dragons was so recent, and so, rather than make his own rebellion, the Dance Part 2, fought over the claim of a woman and her children, Daemon's supporters specifically chose an entirely different narrative.
That could go a long way towards explaining Dana's absence from the story, although the possibility that she died before her son's rebellion can't be ignored. And then there's the rivalry between Bloodraven and Bittersteel. We've touched but lightly upon the issue of Share a Sea Star, instead keeping our focus on the long-running dynastic conflict between their two houses and the way it was exacerbated during the reign of Aegon the Unworthy.
But in addition to the very potent issue of Shiera's choice of Bloodraven, there's the curious fact that whereas Daemon was given Blackfyre by their father, it appears that Brynden Rivers was bequeathed the second Targaryen sword, Dark Sister, perhaps by his famous uncle, the Dragon Knight. Aemon Targaryen was the last known person to bear the sword of Visenya, previously carried by his ancestors Prince Balon and more recently Prince Daemon Targaryen. It specifically mentioned that Bloodraven's mother Melissa Blackwood maintained a friendship with Queen Nerys and her brother, the Dragon Knight, after she was exiled in favour of Barbara Bracken. Was it this relationship that led to her son receiving his famous sword, or was that a decision solely made by Aegon after his younger brother's death?
Whatever the reason, we have to view that gift as likely another cause for Bittersteel to hate his half-brother, and something that may have, at least in part, driven his mad charge at the Redgrass Field when he took up the fallen sword Blackfyre and embarked on a ferocious duel with Bloodraven and Dark Sister that was only cut short by the arrival of Prince Baelor.
None of these questions have been answered by the canon, though we might learn some additional facts if we ever get Blood and Fire, the second part of Archmaester Gildane's Targaryen history. but if the World Book is any indication, we can be sure that the well-known fact that history is written by the victors will contribute to a continued bias in favour of Daeron's line. Daemon's thoughts and motives died on the Redgrass Field, but his line and his memory did not.
In the Mystery Night, Brynden Rivers tells his great-nephew Aegon and Sir Duncan the Tall, old fools and young malcontents still make pilgrimages to the Redgrass Field to plant flowers on the spot where Daemon Blackfyre fell. And in A Storm of Swords, in one of the first mentions of House Blackfyre in the main series, Catelyn Stark tells her son, "The Blackfyre pretenders troubled the Targaryens for 5 generations."
And so the cause will live on and the Blackfyres will come again. For now, in the wake of Daemon's death and its aftermath, we leave you once again with the words of Sir Eustace Osgrey. Treason is only a word when 2 princes fight for a chair where only one may sit. Great lords and common men alike must choose. And when the battle's done, the victors will be hailed as loyal men and true, whilst those who were defeated will be known forevermore as rebels and traitors. That was my fate.
Thanks so much for joining us today. As usual, we'll end the episode by giving credit where credit is due. Thanks to George R.R. Martin for adding the Blackfyre storyline, and to Kevin MacLeod for allowing us to use his music in our production. And now it's time to thank our patrons from the Castle Steel level. If you enjoy the podcast, consider being a patron, and you could be hearing your name here too. Our heartfelt thanks to Atori Loon, AJ, Aegon VI, Ali B, Brennan, Casey, Cassandra, Lady Amalthea, Chris, Christian, Carlos the Mesquite Maester, Courtney, David, Darian, Dimitri B, Dennis, Lady Diana Dane, Liza, Emily of the Erie, Ezra, Felix, Septon Pat, Gerald Garcia, Sir Gladworth, Sir Gregor the Toasty, Lord of the Breadfort, Something Like a Lawyer, Jim McGeehan, Winter's King, Red Jimba Rivers, John Aris, Rider of the Ice Dragon, Cenarion, the White Storm, Jordan G, Climber of Rocks and Father of Dire Poodles, Beau and Beast, Judson, Katie, Kenneth, Tree Girl, Sir Galahoo of What, Anne Hayden Jones and her husband Pip, Lauren, Lemba, Lomas Knight Rider, survivor of the Yeen Sleepover, Mage Marmot, Monaro Geek TV, Maria, Margareta, and our cohort of Matts. Matt A, Matt C, Matt F, Matt K, Matt L, Matt M, Matt R, and Matt S, as well as Beatrix Rainfall, Maester Mary, Molly, Nimble Nick One Iric, Paul B, Paul H, PJ, Peter, King Ray, first of his name, Rickle Pickle, Sam, Sir Swift the Peppered Knight from the House of Black and Grey, Sir Larcelot of Bee Hill, Cern, the Rat Chef de Cuisine, the Peppered Knight, Terry, Sir Terrence, Knight of the Cedars, Steph Lioness, Vince, Quarren Halfhand, and Yvonne. As always, let us know if I've pronounced any of your names wrong, if you have a nickname you'd prefer to use, or if you feel we've left anything out. Visit RadioWesteros.com for quick access to all our podcasts. You can also find a link to our Patreon campaign, donate via PayPal or Ko-fi, and comment on our content there. Or find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or wherever you find your podcasts. And we hope you'll connect with us via Instagram, Discord, email, or Blue Sky. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you soon with a new episode. Bye for now.